They laughed when the broke veteran bought 80 acres of frozen land for just $5. But no one was laughing when his German shepherd uncovered the secret buried beneath the old barn. Caleb Walker had already lost almost everything. The war followed him home in his dreams, jobs never lasted, and the world moved on without him. The only one who stayed was Titan, the German shepherd who once pulled him from a deadly explosion overseas. One winter morning, Caleb walked into a small county auction and bought a piece of land no one wanted. 80 wild acres on a lonely ridge. The townspeople laughed. They said the place was cursed, that winter would kill him before spring ever came. But what no one knew was that Titan's nose was about to uncover something hidden beneath that forgotten land. Something that would change Caleb's life forever. Before the story begins, tell me something. Drop a quick comment and let me know where you're watching from today. It's always amazing to see people from all over the world gathering around stories like this. The auctioneer's gavel struck the wooden podium with a sharp crack that echoed through the small county courtroom. Outside, the wind moved across the mountains like a slow breath, carrying the dry scent of pine and snow down from the Bitterroot Range. The town of Alder Ridge sat quiet under a pale Montana sky, the kind of sky that seemed too wide for the world beneath it. Inside the courthouse, 6 people sat in folding chairs. Ranchers, mostly. Old men in worn boots and dusty hats. They had come out of habit more than interest, the way men in small towns showed up for things simply because that was what you did. The county clerk stood beside a long table stacked with property files. Next to him, the auctioneer wiped his glasses on his sleeve and looked down at the last sheet on his clipboard. "Final listing," he said. His voice carried the dry tone of someone who had done the same job for too many years. No one in the room leaned forward. No one expected anything interesting. The auction had already moved through a burned-out gas station, a half-acre lot beside the highway, and a strip of rocky grazing land no one wanted. The bids had been small and tired, like the town itself. The auctioneer cleared his throat. 80 acres, Section 14, Bitterroot Valley. Abandoned farmhouse, outbuildings, property sold as is. Minimum bid, $5. A few quiet chuckles moved through the room. Someone muttered, "Hell, they should be paying someone to take that place." Another voice added, "That ridge farm? That place kills people in winter." More laughter followed. No one raised a hand. At the back of the room, a man stood near the doorway. He hadn't taken a seat when he came in. Most people hadn't noticed him at first. He was tall but thin, in the way men become after too many hard months. His coat was an old army field jacket, faded almost gray from years of sun and dust. The sleeves were worn at the cuffs. The boots on his feet had seen too many miles. Beside him sat a German shepherd. The dog was large, broad-shouldered, its coat dark sable with streaks of rust along the legs. Its ears were alert, its amber eyes scanning the room with a quiet intelligence. The dog didn't move, not even when the men laughed. The man's name was Caleb Walker, and the dog's name was Titan. Titan sat perfectly still, pressed against Caleb's leg like a shadow that refused to leave. The auctioneer looked around the room again. $5, he repeated. Silence answered him. A fly buzzed lazily near the window. Somewhere outside, a pickup truck rattled down the main street. Then Caleb lifted his hand. It was a small motion, but in the quiet room, it felt loud. "I'll take it," he said. His voice carried the rough edge of someone who hadn't spoken much lately. A few heads turned. The old ranchers looked him over. They saw the worn jacket, the travel pack slung over one shoulder, the dog. One of the men leaned toward another and whispered, loud enough for half the room to hear, "Kid doesn't know what he's buying." Another shook his head. "That ridgeland's cursed." The auctioneer blinked once. "You're bidding $5?" he asked. Caleb nodded. Titan shifted slightly beside him, but didn't break his calm posture. The auctioneer shrugged. $5 going once." No one spoke. "Going twice." A pause stretched across the room like a held breath. Then the gavel came down. "Sold!" The sound echoed in the wooden room. Just like that, 80 acres of forgotten land changed hands. The ranchers watched Caleb walk forward to the table. Up close, the signs of war were easier to see. The scar that ran across his left eyebrow, the faint stiffness in the way his shoulders moved, the tiredness in his eyes. The county clerk slid a piece of paper across the table. "Name?" "Caleb Walker." The clerk wrote it down slowly. Walker. He paused when he saw the last name. "Any relation to the Walkers who used to own that place?" Caleb shook his head once. "Don't know." The truth was simpler than that. He'd never known much about any family. The clerk pushed the receipt forward. "You'll have 90 days to pay the back property taxes," he said. "How much?" The clerk checked the file. $1,500. Someone behind Caleb laughed. "Kid's got $5 for land and owes $1,500 already." Another voice said, "Won't last a winter out there." The clerk handed Caleb a small ring of rusted keys. They were old enough that the metal had turned dark with time. "These belong to the last owner," he said. Caleb took them. The keys were heavier than they looked. For a moment, he just stood there holding them. Titan rose to his feet beside him. The dog's tail moved once. Slow, steady. Caleb signed the paper. His handwriting was neat, despite the faint tremor in his fingers. Then he stepped away from the table. As he passed the row of ranchers, one of them spoke again. "You ever seen that place?" Caleb stopped. "No." The old man shook his head. "That ridge sits right where the wind comes down the mountain. Snow piles 10 feet deep some winters." Another added, "House is falling apart. Roof's gone on one side. Road floods every spring. People used to say the place was haunted." The ranchers chuckled again. Caleb listened to them. Then he clipped the ring of keys to his belt. "I've lived in worse places," he said quietly. Titan walked beside him as they headed for the door. When Caleb pushed the courthouse door open, the cold mountain air rushed inside. The sky above Alder Ridge was turning pale gold with late afternoon light. The mountains stood dark against the horizon. Titan stepped outside first. The dog paused on the courthouse steps and lifted his nose to the wind. For a moment, he stood completely still. Then his tail moved again, like he recognized something far away. Caleb followed him down the steps. He walked across the dusty street to where his truck waited. The truck was old, a faded green Chevy pickup that rattled whenever the engine ran. Titan jumped into the passenger seat like he had done 1,000 times before. Caleb started the engine. The truck coughed once, then settled into a rough idle. He sat there for a moment with his hands on the wheel. The keys from the auction rested in his palm. 80 acres. $5. A place he had never seen. Most men in that room believed he had just made the worst mistake of his life. Maybe they were right. Caleb glanced at Titan. The dog was watching him with those steady amber eyes. The same eyes that had once pulled him through smoke and chaos on a battlefield half a world away. Titan gave a quiet huff, as if to say he was ready. Caleb turned the truck toward the mountain road. "Let's see what we bought," he murmured. The truck rolled out of Alder Ridge and into the long stretch of empty land beyond town. Behind them, the courthouse door closed. Ahead of them, the Bitterroot Mountains waited. And somewhere up on a lonely ridge, 80 acres of forgotten land were about to change everything. The truck climbed slowly out of Alder Ridge, its tires humming against the narrow mountain road. Pine trees closed in on both sides, tall and silent like watchful sentries. The air grew colder the higher they drove. Caleb Walker kept both hands steady on the steering wheel, but his eyes moved constantly. Mirrors, tree line, road ahead, old habits. The war had ended 3 years ago, but it hadn't ended inside his head. Titan sat upright in the passenger seat, his large body balanced easily despite the bumps in the road. Every so often the German shepherd glanced at Caleb, the way a trained dog checks in with its handler. Always aware, always ready. They had learned that together. Afghanistan had been a place of heat and dust and noise that never stopped. Helicopters, gunfire, engines, shouting over radios. Days where the air itself felt tense, like something terrible was waiting to happen. Caleb had been 24 when he deployed. Young enough to believe he could carry anything. Old enough to learn he couldn't. Titan had been a military working dog then, attached to Caleb's unit after the previous handler rotated home. The dog had arrived lean, disciplined, and already trained to detect explosives buried beneath the dirt roads that wound through the desert villages. The first time Caleb worked with him, the trainer had said something simple. "Trust the dog more than you trust yourself." At the time, Caleb thought it sounded like a joke. 3 weeks later, Titan stopped on a patrol road outside Kandahar. He refused to move forward. Not a growl, not a bark. Just planted paws and those steady amber eyes looking straight at Caleb. The squad halted. The bomb team was called in. Buried beneath the road was a pressure plate explosive powerful enough to tear a convoy apart. Titan saved 6 lives that morning. After that, Caleb trusted the dog with everything. The truck rounded a bend in the mountain road. The sound of wind moving through the trees rose suddenly, sharp and rushing. Caleb's grip tightened on the wheel. For a moment, the wind sounded like helicopter blades. The same low, chopping rhythm that had haunted his sleep for years. His breathing changed, short, fast. The road in front of him blurred slightly. Titan noticed immediately. The dog shifted closer on the seat. A large paw rested gently on Caleb's arm. Not hard, just enough. Caleb blinked once, then again. The road returned. The trees were just trees. The wind was only wind. He exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he murmured. "I'm good." Titan watched him for another moment before relaxing again. That was how most days went now. Caleb had come home from the war with a duffel bag and a head full of noise that never completely stopped. Sleep was the worst part. Night turned quiet in ways that felt wrong after years of constant movement. In that silence, his mind replayed things he didn't want to see again. Flashes of fire, voices shouting, the hollow ringing after explosions. Sometimes he woke up sitting straight in bed before he even realized he had fallen asleep. Titan always woke first. The dog would press his head against Caleb's chest until the shaking stopped. Sometimes that took minutes, sometimes longer. But Titan never moved away. Caleb had tried living with family after the war. His older brother had offered the spare bedroom in Spokane. It lasted 3 weeks. The city noise never stopped. Cars backfiring made Caleb flinch. Crowded stores made his skin crawl. People looked at him differently when they noticed the way his eyes scanned every exit. They meant well, but they didn't understand. Most people didn't. So he left, picked up odd jobs, fence repairs, hay hauling, whatever kept gas in the truck and food in a bowl for Titan. The open country helped. Out here, there were fewer sudden noises, fewer crowds, more sky. Caleb had been drifting across Montana for months before he found the listing in a county library computer. A tax auction, old farmland, 80 acres, $5 minimum bid. He didn't know why he went. Maybe because the road had been empty that morning. Maybe because Titan lifted his head when Caleb said the town name out loud. Or maybe because something deep inside him was tired of moving. The truck crested a ridge. The view opened suddenly. The Bitterroot Valley spread below them in wide, rolling fields, the mountains rising blue and distant beyond it. Caleb slowed the truck. The road ahead turned to gravel. According to the faded map folded on the passenger seat, his new land sat somewhere beyond the next set of hills. Titan leaned slightly toward the open window, nose working the cold air. The dog's ears twitched. Something about this place held his attention. Caleb glanced over. "You smell it too, huh?" Titan gave a quiet rumble deep in his chest. Not alarm, interest. Caleb followed the gravel road for another mile until the map told him to turn onto something that barely deserved the word road. 2 narrow tracks cut through tall grass. No tire marks. No recent use. He steered the truck between them. Grass brushed the underside of the doors as the vehicle crawled forward. The sky had shifted toward evening now, sunlight turning the mountain peaks copper and gold. Up ahead, something appeared through the trees. A shape. Angular. Still. Caleb eased his foot off the gas. Titan sat forward, muscles tense. Through the gaps in the pines, the outline of a house slowly emerged. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the damage. One side of the roof sagged badly. The porch leaned like an old man with a crooked spine. Several windows were missing entirely, dark, empty holes staring out across the field. Behind the house stood a barn, or what used to be one. Half the roof had collapsed. Boards hung loose along the walls. The entire structure tilted slightly toward the slope, as if gravity had been slowly pulling it down for years. Caleb stopped the truck. For a long moment, he didn't move. This was what $5 bought. Titan jumped down from the seat before Caleb even opened the door. The dog landed lightly in the tall grass, his head lifted. The wind carried the smell of old wood, dust, animals that had passed through and never stayed. Titan began walking slowly toward the barn. Caleb followed a few steps behind. The grass whispered around their legs. Everything else was quiet. No nearby houses, no roads, just mountains and sky and 80 acres of land that looked like it had been forgotten by the rest of the world. Titan stopped near the barn door, his nose lowered to the ground. He sniffed once, then twice. His tail lifted slightly. Caleb watched him. The dog began pacing in a slow circle. Something here had his full attention. Titan pawed lightly at the dirt. Then he barked once, short, sharp. Caleb stepped closer. "What is it?" Titan didn't answer, of course, but the dog kept scratching the ground near the barn entrance like he had found something buried just beneath the surface. Caleb frowned. The ground there looked ordinary enough, just packed dirt and old hay. But Titan didn't stop digging. The dog's claws scraped against something metallic beneath the dirt. A faint sound. Caleb crouched. He brushed away a handful of loose soil. His fingers touched cold iron. A small, rusted ring lay half-buried beneath the barn floor. Caleb stared at it, then at Titan. The German shepherd's tail wagged slowly, as if he already knew. Whatever waited beneath that ring was the first secret this forgotten land had kept hidden for decades. Caleb brushed away more dirt with the side of his hand. The metal ring was cold and rough under his fingers, rust biting into his skin as he tried to lift it. At first, it didn't move. Titan watched closely, his head tilted, ears forward. "All right," Caleb muttered quietly. "Let's see." He dug around the edges with a piece of broken wood lying nearby. The dirt loosened slowly, revealing a square outline beneath the barn floor. Old boards had been cut neatly decades earlier, their seams almost invisible beneath layers of dust and hay. A hatch. Caleb sat back on his heels. The sun had dipped lower behind the mountains now, and the barn interior filled with long, golden shadows that stretched across the floor like fingers reaching into the dark. Titan sniffed along the edges again, then looked up at Caleb, waiting. Caleb gripped the ring again and pulled harder. The hatch shifted with a long groan of wood that hadn't moved in many years. Dust fell from the cracks as it lifted slowly, inch by inch. When it finally opened, a breath of cold air rose from the darkness below. It smelled old, dry, forgotten. Caleb held the hatch open with one hand and leaned forward to peer inside. Wooden steps disappeared into the shadows beneath the barn. Titan moved closer to the opening and sniffed the air again, his nose twitching. Then he glanced back at Caleb. The look was familiar. The same look Titan gave before stepping into danger overseas. "Ready when you are." Caleb exhaled slowly. "Guess we're doing this." He pulled his phone from his pocket and switched on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, revealing narrow wooden stairs leading down into a small underground room. Carefully, Caleb lowered himself onto the first step. The wood creaked under his weight, but held. Titan followed behind him, paws landing quietly, one step at a time. At the bottom of the stairs, Caleb stood still for a moment. The underground space was small but solid. The walls were reinforced with old timber beams, and the ceiling sat just high enough that Caleb didn't have to duck. The flashlight beam swept across shelves lining the walls. Dust-covered jars, old metal boxes, tools wrapped in cloth. It looked like a survival bunker from another era. A place someone built when the world felt uncertain. Titan moved ahead, sniffing along the shelves with careful interest. Caleb stepped forward slowly, his boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. A lantern hung from a hook near the wall. Beneath it sat a small metal trunk. Caleb brushed the dust from its lid. The hinges squealed when he opened it. Inside were stacks of old envelopes tied together with twine. Letters. Beside them lay a leather-bound notebook worn smooth with age. Caleb picked up the notebook first. The cover cracked slightly as he opened it. The handwriting inside was neat but firm, the ink faded but still readable. The first page read, "Walker Family Log, 1963. Caleb felt something stir in his chest. Walker. He flipped to the next page. This shelter was built beneath the barn in case the worst ever comes. Food stores rotated yearly. Water sealed in steel drums. Tools for repair kept wrapped and dry. The handwriting paused for a line, then continued. If my family ever finds this place again, know that this land was meant to keep you safe. Caleb swallowed. He turned another page. Dates filled the margins. Notes about the farm, the weather, harvests. And scattered among them were small personal entries. Mary planted apple trees along the west fence today. Snow came early this year. Roof held strong. Caleb would have liked this place. Caleb frowned. He read that line again. Caleb would have liked this place. The words were written nearly 50 years ago. Titan padded over and nudged Caleb's elbow. The dog had found something else. Another box sat tucked beneath the lowest shelf. Caleb pulled it out. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of cash. Old bills wrapped in rubber bands that had long since dried and cracked. He counted quickly. Not a fortune, but enough. More than Caleb had held in his hands in years. Titan watched him carefully. "You might have just saved us, buddy," Caleb said quietly. The dog wagged his tail once. Caleb returned the money to the box and looked around the bunker again. The shelves held canned goods sealed in thick metal tins. Many were probably too old to eat now, but the intention behind them was clear. Someone had prepared this place for survival. Someone who believed their family might one day need it. Caleb picked up the bundle of letters. Every envelope carried the same last name, Walker. The oldest letter was dated 1971. The newest was from the early 80s. He untied the twine and opened the first envelope. Inside was a short note written in the same careful handwriting. To whoever finds this place someday, if you are a Walker, then this land belongs to you as much as it ever belonged to me. Keep the farm alive if you can, and keep the door open for people who need it. A man never knows when someone might come walking out of the mountains with nowhere else to go. Caleb stared at the letter for a long moment. Titan sat beside him quietly. Outside, the wind picked up again across the ridge. The old barn creaked softly above their heads. Caleb folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. He closed the trunk and rested his hands on the lid. $5. That was all the land had cost him. But what he had found here was worth far more. A shelter, a history, and maybe a place that once belonged to his family. Titan nudged Caleb's shoulder again. Caleb smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said softly. "I think we just found our first real break." Above them, the wind moved through the tall grass across the ridge. And for the first time since he had come home from the war, Caleb Walker felt like he might have finally found a place where he could stay. The wind moved across the ridge above the barn, brushing through the tall grass like a quiet tide rolling over the hills. Caleb stood at the bottom of the bunker stairs for a long moment, the old letter still in his hands. A place that once belonged to his family. The thought felt strange, almost unreal. He had spent years moving from one temporary job to another, sleeping in places that never felt like home. Now, suddenly, he stood inside a hidden room beneath a farm that might have belonged to the Walkers long before he was born. Titan shifted beside him, sniffing the air again. The dog moved toward the shelves lining the wall and began pacing slowly. Caleb watched him. Titan was thorough, always had been. Even overseas, Titan would circle an area 2 or 3 times before deciding it was safe.
Now he was doing the same thing here. The dog lowered his head, sniffing along the wooden beams that supported the bunker walls. Then he stopped. Titan's ears lifted. He scratched once at the floor. Caleb stepped closer. "What is it?" The floor beneath Titan's paws looked normal, just old planks worn smooth with age. But Titan pawed at the same spot again, his claws clicking lightly against the wood. Then the dog barked once. Short, sharp. Caleb crouched and aimed the flashlight down. There it was. A thin seam in the floorboards, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. "All right," Caleb said quietly. He set the lantern aside and pulled a small pry bar from the tool shelf. The metal edge slid carefully into the crack between the boards. With a slow push, the wood lifted. Another hatch.
Smaller than the first. The board creaked open, revealing a shallow compartment hidden beneath the floor. Inside sat a long wooden box wrapped in oilcloth. Caleb lifted it out carefully and set it on the floor. Titan sat beside him, tail moving slowly. Caleb unwrapped the cloth. The box lid opened with a dull thud. Inside lay several objects placed with careful precision. A revolver, old but clean. A compass, a folded map, and beneath them, another journal. This one looked newer than the first, though the leather cover had still aged with time. Caleb opened it slowly. The first page carried a different handwriting. Not the same careful script from the earlier journal. This one looked rushed, heavier, as if written by someone under stress. March 1982. If someone finds this, then the farm may finally belong to the Walker family again. Caleb frowned. He flipped the page. My father built the first shelter in the 60s. He always believed hard times would return someday. Maybe he was right. But the real reason I hid this second box is not fear of war. It's fear of men. Caleb paused. The wind outside the barn rose again, rattling loose boards overhead. He read the next entry. There are people in this valley who want this land. They think it hides something valuable. Maybe they're right. But if they take the property, they'll never stop digging until they destroy everything my father built. Caleb turned another page. The writing grew darker, more urgent. I've hidden the documents here, proof of what belongs to the Walker family. If my son ever comes back, he deserves to know the truth. Caleb's heartbeat quickened slightly. His son. He kept reading. If you're reading this, then you're probably Caleb. Caleb froze. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in his hand. Titan looked up at him immediately. The dog could always sense when Caleb's breathing changed. Caleb swallowed. The journal page continued. I never told you the full story before we left. Not because I didn't trust you, because I was afraid. Victor Langston had already begun buying up land all across this valley. Your grandfather refused to sell. That's when the trouble started. Caleb felt a faint pressure building behind his eyes. Victor Langston. The name stirred something distant in his memory. His father had mentioned it once. A wealthy ranch owner somewhere in the valley. Caleb kept reading. Langston claimed the road crossing our land belonged to him. He said we had no legal access to the property without his permission. But that was a lie. Your grandfather owned that road fair and square. Langston just had more lawyers. Caleb turned another page. If anything happens to me, the truth is hidden inside the county records. But I've left copies here. The land was never meant to leave our family. Caleb stared at the page for a long moment.
Then he looked back into the box. Beneath the revolver and compass sat a sealed envelope. Thick. Heavy. He opened it slowly. Inside were folded legal documents, property deeds, survey maps, and something else. A faded photograph. Caleb lifted it closer to the flashlight. A man stood in front of the barn. Younger, stronger, but unmistakably a walker. The man rested one hand on the barn door. Beside him sat a German shepherd. The resemblance to Titan was striking. Caleb exhaled slowly. Guess we're not the first team around here, huh? Titan wagged his tail once. The wind outside howled softly through the broken boards of the barn. Caleb closed the box again. His mind raced with questions. About the land, about his father, about the man named Victor Langston. But one thing was already clear. The farm he bought for $5 had never truly stopped belonging to the Walker family. And somewhere in this quiet valley, there were people who might not like that the last Walker had finally come home.
The sun disappeared behind the Bitterroot Mountains faster than Caleb expected. One moment the ridge was glowing orange with evening light, the next, the valley was slipping into cold blue shadows. Caleb climbed the ladder out of the bunker, Titan following right behind him. The barn creaked softly in the wind, its old wooden bones shifting with every gust. Caleb pulled the hatch closed again and brushed dirt across the seams the way he had found it. For now, the bunker would remain their secret. Titan stood near the barn door, scanning the darkening field. The dog's posture had changed, ears forward, body still, listening. Caleb stepped outside. The temperature had already dropped sharply. In Montana, the mountains had a way of pulling winter down early, like a curtain falling before anyone expected it. The grass moved slowly in the wind. The old farmhouse stood about 50 yards away, leaning slightly but still upright. "That's home for now," Caleb said quietly. Titan trotted ahead of him toward the house. The porch groaned when Caleb stepped onto it. One board cracked beneath his weight, and he made a mental note to replace it before snow came. If snow came early. Inside, the house smelled like dust and dry wood. Caleb opened the door slowly. The hinges complained loudly. The last people who lived here had left in a hurry decades ago. Furniture remained scattered throughout the rooms. A kitchen table leaned sideways against the wall. A broken chair sat in the corner like it had been waiting for someone to fix it. Titan walked through each room carefully. He checked the kitchen first, then the small living room, then the hallway. Only after the dog finished his quiet patrol did he finally sit down near the fireplace. All clear. Caleb dropped his backpack onto the floor. "Guess we start here." He found an old wood stove in the kitchen and spent the next hour clearing ashes and debris from the pipe. The chimney still worked, though barely. By the time the first fire caught, the room had grown dark enough that Caleb had to light one of the lanterns from the bunker. Warm light filled the kitchen. Titan stretched out on the floor beside the stove. Outside, the wind continued to rise. Caleb stepped onto the porch again. The mountains were almost invisible now, hidden behind thick clouds rolling across the sky. He knew that look. Storm clouds. The kind that arrived fast and stayed for days. Montana winters didn't ask permission. They simply arrived. Caleb returned inside and began patching the worst holes in the house with spare boards he found in the barn. The roof above the bedroom leaked badly, but the kitchen seemed solid enough. For tonight, it would do. Titan watched him work. The dog's eyes followed every movement with quiet focus. That was another habit from the war. Titan never relaxed completely. Neither did Caleb. Hours later, the fire had burned down to glowing coals. The wind outside had grown stronger. Caleb lay on the floor near the stove with a blanket pulled over his shoulders. Titan slept beside him. For a while, everything was quiet. Then the wind slammed against the side of the house. The old windows rattled violently. Caleb's eyes snapped open. In his mind, the sound became something else. Rotor blades, dust, shouting voices. His breathing sped up. The room felt smaller suddenly. Titan lifted his head immediately. The dog crawled closer, pressing his body against Caleb's chest. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut. The memories were loud tonight. The explosion, the smoke. The moment Titan dragged him away from the wreckage of their convoy. Caleb's hands trembled. Titan nudged his face gently. Then again. Slow. Steady. Caleb focused on the dog's breathing. In, out. In, out. The storm outside continued to rage, but the sound slowly lost its sharp edge. It was only wind, only winter, not war. After several minutes, Caleb finally opened his eyes again. Titan was still there, watching. Caleb reached out and rubbed the dog's neck. Still got my 6, huh? Titan thumped his tail once on the floor. Outside, snow had begun to fall. At first it came lightly, drifting down through the night air. Then the wind shifted. By morning, the entire ridge had vanished beneath a thick white blanket. Caleb stepped outside and looked across the 80 acres of land he now owned. The farmhouse roof was already buried beneath snow. The barn leaned silently against the storm. The mountains beyond the valley had disappeared completely. Montana winter had arrived. And it had arrived early. Titan stood beside Caleb, snow collecting on the dog's thick fur. For a moment, Caleb felt the familiar weight of doubt pressing against his chest. 80 acres. A collapsing house. A winter that could kill a man who wasn't ready. But then he looked down at Titan. The German shepherd stood steady against the wind, unbothered, unafraid. Caleb gave a quiet laugh. "Well, partner," he said, staring across the frozen land. "Looks like we've got some work ahead of us." Behind them, the little farmhouse creaked but held. And beneath the barn floor, the hidden bunker waited patiently, holding the past that might one day decide the future of the Walker land. Morning came slowly to the ridge. The storm that had arrived overnight left the valley buried under a quiet blanket of snow. Every fence post, every patch of grass, every broken board of the old farmhouse wore a layer of white that softened the rough edges of the land. Caleb stepped outside just after sunrise. The cold bit immediately at his lungs. Montana winter didn't creep in gently. It claimed the land in one hard breath. Titan trotted ahead of him into the snow, leaving deep paw prints across the frozen yard. The dog seemed almost energized by the cold, his thick coat built for weather like this. Caleb pulled his jacket tighter. They had food for a few days, wood for the stove, but the truth was simple. If he wanted to survive the winter on this ridge, he needed help. Caleb looked down toward the valley. A narrow road cut through the snow like a thin scar across the white fields. That road led to the nearest town, Alder Ridge. Population barely over 600. It was the same town where people had laughed when he bought the land. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "Well," he said quietly. Guess we're meeting the neighbors. Titan wagged his tail. The truck started reluctantly in the cold, the engine grumbling like an old man waking too early. By the time Caleb reached town, the storm clouds had begun to clear. Alder Ridge looked exactly the way small mountain towns always did in winter. A single main street, a gas station, a small diner with fogged windows, and a hardware store with a faded sign that read, Collins Farm Supply. Caleb parked the truck and stepped out. Titan jumped down beside him. The bell above the store door jingled softly when Caleb pushed it open. Warm air and the smell of wood and machine oil greeted him. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with silver hair tied back in a loose braid. She looked up slowly. Her eyes moved first to Caleb, then to Titan. The dog sat calmly at Caleb's side. The woman studied them both for a moment. "Well now," she said, voice low and steady. "That's a face I haven't seen around here before." Caleb nodded politely. "Name's Caleb Walker." The woman froze slightly. Not dramatically, just enough that Caleb noticed. Her eyes narrowed with curiosity. "Walker, you say?" Caleb nodded. "I bought the old place on Dead Ridge." For a moment, the store was completely silent. Then the woman leaned back slowly against the counter. "Well, I'll be." She let out a quiet breath. "Didn't think I'd ever hear that name again." Caleb frowned. "You knew the family?" The woman smiled faintly. "Everybody around here knew the Walkers." She stepped out from behind the counter and extended a hand. "Martha Collins." Caleb shook it. Her grip was stronger than he expected. "Your grandfather used to come through here every fall," she continued. "Bought tools, seed, lumber. Hard-working man." Her eyes moved toward Titan. "And that dog of yours?" Titan lifted his ears slightly. "He's a good one," Martha said quietly. Caleb smiled. "The best." Martha walked toward the shelves and began gathering supplies. "You planning to stay up there through winter?" "That's the idea." She glanced back over her shoulder. "You're either brave or a little crazy." "Probably both." Martha chuckled softly. "Well, if you're staying on that ridge, you're going to need more than a stove and good intentions." She placed several items on the counter: heavy gloves, extra lantern fuel, a thick coil of rope. "Take these," she said. Caleb frowned. "I can pay." Martha shook her head. "Your grandfather helped half this town during the hard winters back in the 70s. She pushed the supplies closer. "Consider this a long overdue thank you." Caleb hesitated, then nodded quietly. "Thank you." The bell above the door rang again. A tall man stepped inside. Broad shoulders, dark braided hair, a heavy coat dusted with snow. He stopped when he saw Titan, then looked at Caleb. "You the Walker who bought the ridge?" Caleb nodded. "That's me." The man studied him for a moment, then smiled slightly. "Name's Luke Greyhawk." He extended a hand. "Your barn roof won't last the winter." Caleb laughed softly. "I figured that out yesterday." Luke glanced toward Martha. "She told you about the storm season yet?" "Not in detail." Luke nodded toward the door. "I'll come take a look tomorrow." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You a contractor?" "Carpenter." Luke shrugged. "Besides, your grandfather once fixed my father's roof for free." He gestured toward Titan. "And anyone who keeps a dog like that deserves a fair chance." Titan wagged his tail once. Later that afternoon, Caleb stopped at the small diner across the street. The warmth inside felt almost overwhelming after the cold. A woman behind the counter poured coffee without asking. "You must be the walker Martha mentioned," she said. Caleb blinked. "News travels fast." She smiled. "Town this size, everything travels fast." She extended a hand. "Rosa Delgado." Caleb shook it. "Caleb." Rosa glanced down at Titan. "Well, aren't you handsome?" Titan sat proudly beside Caleb's chair. Rosa leaned on the counter. "You know that land you bought?" Caleb nodded. "People around here used to say the ridge was cursed." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Cursed?" She shrugged. "Every family that tried to live there eventually left." Her voice softened slightly. "But the walkers stayed the longest." Caleb looked down into his coffee. Titan rested quietly at his feet. Rosa smiled gently. "Well, maybe it just needed the right people." Outside, the snow continued to fall across the valley. And for the first time since Caleb arrived, the lonely ridge no longer felt quite so empty. The drive back up to the ridge felt different that afternoon. The road was still narrow, still lined with tall pines and snow-covered brush, but something had changed in Caleb's chest. The weight he had carried for years, quiet, heavy, always pressing down on him, felt a little lighter. Maybe it was the warmth of the diner. Maybe it was Martha Collins pressing supplies into his hands like he already belonged here. Maybe it was Luke Greyhawk offering to repair a roof that most people would have laughed at. Or maybe it was simply the fact that for the first time since coming home from the war, Caleb had spoken to people who didn't look at him like he was broken. Titan rested his head against the truck door as they climbed the final mile of road toward the farm. The wind had calmed. The sky stretched clear and pale above the mountains. When the farmhouse came into view, Titan suddenly lifted his head. His ears snapped forward. Caleb noticed immediately. "What is it?" Titan gave a low rumble. Not loud, just enough to tell Caleb something wasn't right. Caleb slowed the truck. Ahead of them, near the old gate at the bottom of the property, a long black SUV sat parked in the snow. The engine idled quietly. Caleb's stomach tightened. No one should have been up here. The road to the ridge barely qualified as a road at all. He pulled the truck to a stop 20 yards away. Titan stepped down from the passenger seat slowly. The dog's posture was alert now, every muscle ready. The SUV door opened. A tall man stepped out. He wore an expensive wool coat and polished boots that didn't belong anywhere near a muddy ranch road. His hair was gray but carefully trimmed, and his expression carried the calm confidence of someone used to getting exactly what he wanted. The man studied Caleb for a moment. Then his eyes shifted to Titan. A faint smile touched his lips. "That must be the famous Walker dog." Caleb frowned slightly. "Do I know you?" The man stepped closer, brushing snow from his sleeve. "Victor Langston." The name struck Caleb immediately. He had seen it in the journal. Victor Langston. The man his father had written about. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Thought so," Langston said calmly. "You have your grandfather's eyes." Titan moved closer to Caleb's leg. Not aggressive, but ready. Langston noticed the movement. "Beautiful dog," he said lightly. "German Shepherd, I assume?" "His name's Titan." Langston nodded politely. "Well, Titan has excellent instincts." He looked past Caleb toward the farmhouse sitting on the ridge, then back again. "I heard someone bought this land at the auction." His smile widened slightly. "I just wanted to meet the new owner." Caleb crossed his arms. "You drove all the way up here for introductions?" Langston chuckled. "Something like that." He gestured casually toward the valley behind them. "You see, Mr. Walker, I own most of the land surrounding this ridge. Caleb said nothing. Langston continued. Ranches, grazing fields, timber contracts. This valley has been part of my family's holdings for years. Titan's ears flicked again. Langston noticed. Sharp dog, he murmured. Then he turned his attention back to Caleb. The land you bought is inconveniently placed. Caleb raised an eyebrow. Inconvenient? Langston nodded. The road leading up here? He pointed toward the narrow path cutting across the lower hillside. That road crosses property I legally own. Caleb felt the air grow colder around him. So? Langston's smile returned. So that means your access to this farm depends on my permission. Titan gave a low growl. Langston glanced down at the dog. No offense, Titan. He stepped back slightly. Now, I'm a reasonable man. He reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded document. A simple solution exists. He held the paper out toward Caleb. A purchase agreement. Caleb didn't take it. Langston continued calmly. I'm willing to buy your 80 acres for $10,000. Caleb almost laughed. He had paid $5. But something about the man's tone made the offer feel less generous than it sounded. What happens if I say no? Caleb asked. Langston shrugged lightly. Well, he gestured toward the road again. I suppose that road would be closed. Caleb's eyes narrowed. You can't just block access to my property. Langston tilted his head slightly. Actually, I can. His voice remained polite, but the meaning beneath it was unmistakable. If you can't reach the farm, you can't live here. The wind swept across the ridge again, sending loose snow drifting around their boots. Titan stood perfectly still beside Caleb. Langston slipped the document back into his coat. Think it over, he said smoothly. I'll return in a week. He turned toward his SUV. Before climbing inside, he looked back one last time. Montana winters are difficult. His eyes moved briefly to Titan, then back to Caleb. And isolation can be dangerous. The SUV engine roared softly as it pulled away down the narrow road. Within minutes, it disappeared behind the trees. Silence returned to the ridge. Caleb stood motionless in the snow. Titan looked up at him. For a long time, Caleb didn't speak. Then he finally exhaled slowly. Well, partner? He looked out across the 80 acres of frozen land stretching beneath the winter sky. Looks like we just met the neighbor. Titan gave a low rumble. And somewhere far below the ridge, Victor Langston was already planning how to take the Walker land back. Winter settled over the Bitterroot Valley like a heavy blanket. Days became shorter. The sun rose late behind the mountains and disappeared again before Caleb could finish half the work waiting around the farm. Snow covered the broken pasture fences. Ice formed along the roof edges of the old farmhouse. But each morning, Caleb Walker woke before sunrise. And each morning, Titan was already awake. The German shepherd would sit quietly near the door, watching the first light crawl across the snow-covered ridge. Ready for the day. Ready for whatever came next. 3 days after the storm, Luke Greyhawk's truck appeared on the narrow road leading to the farm. Titan noticed it first. The dog lifted his head and trotted toward the porch, tail moving slightly. Caleb stepped outside. Luke climbed out of the truck carrying a heavy toolbox. You weren't kidding about that roof, he said, staring up at the leaning barn. Caleb laughed quietly. Thought you might say that. Luke studied the structure for a long moment. If we don't brace those beams soon, the next heavy snow could bring the whole thing down. Caleb nodded. Let's get started. For hours, they worked in the cold. Luke cut new support beams from timber stacked near the barn. Caleb hauled the wood into place. Titan moved around the worksite carefully, watching both men the way he used to watch soldiers during patrol. Alert. Protective. The barn groaned with every shift of weight. Old wood cracked beneath the pressure of snow that had built up along the roof. Luke climbed onto a ladder and hammered the first beam into place. "Hold that steady!" he called down. Caleb braced the ladder. For a moment, everything seemed stable. Then the wind changed. A sudden gust slammed against the barn wall. The old roof shifted. A loud crack echoed through the structure. Luke's eyes widened. "Move!" Caleb looked up just in time to see the support beam above Luke split. The weight of snow pushed the roof downward. Wood snapped, boards shattered. Titan barked sharply. The barn roof collapsed in a violent rush of timber and snow. Caleb barely had time to jump back before the structure gave way. A cloud of dust and ice exploded outward. For several seconds, the world was nothing but falling wood and noise. Then silence. Caleb pushed himself up from the snow. "Luke! I'm all right!" Luke's voice answered from behind the wreckage. But before Caleb could move, Titan bolted forward. The German shepherd leapt across broken boards toward the center of the collapse. Caleb's heart jumped. "Titan, stop!" Too late. Another section of the roof slid loose. A heavy beam crashed down near the dog. Titan yelped. The sound cut through Caleb like a knife. Caleb ran forward, pulling debris aside with frantic hands. Snow burned his fingers. Broken boards scraped his arms. Finally, he reached Titan. The dog was pinned beneath a fallen beam. One of Titan's back legs twisted at an unnatural angle. But the moment Titan saw Caleb, his tail thumped weakly against the snow. Caleb's chest tightened. "Hang on, buddy." He lifted the beam carefully. Luke rushed over to help. Together they freed the dog. Titan tried to stand. His leg buckled instantly. Caleb caught him before he could fall. For a moment, Caleb simply knelt there in the snow, holding the dog against his chest. Titan's breathing was fast, but his eyes remained calm. Trusting. Always trusting. Luke crouched beside them. "Looks like a fracture," he said quietly. Caleb swallowed. The nearest veterinarian was 2 towns away, and the road down the ridge was already freezing over. Titan licked Caleb's hand weakly. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment. "We're getting you help," he whispered. But the day's trouble wasn't finished. When Caleb finally drove into town, with Titan wrapped in blankets across the passenger seat, something felt wrong immediately. The diner lights were off. The door to Colin's farm supply was locked. A sign hung in the window. Closed until further notice. Caleb frowned. Luke parked his truck beside him. "That's strange." They stepped inside the gas station to ask around. The clerk looked uneasy when Caleb mentioned Martha. "She got a visit yesterday," the man said quietly. "From who?" The clerk hesitated. "Victor Langston." Caleb felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. "What happened?" The clerk shrugged nervously. "Langston owns the supply contracts around here. Said anyone doing business with the Walker farm might lose their deliveries." Luke's jaw tightened. "He's squeezing the town." Caleb looked down at Titan. The dog lay quietly, injured but still alert. The valley outside the gas station looked peaceful under its blanket of snow. But Caleb understood something now. Victor Langston wasn't just trying to buy the Walker land. He was trying to make sure Caleb couldn't survive long enough to keep it. And as Caleb stepped back out into the cold evening air, Titan resting carefully in his arms. For the first time since arriving on the ridge, Caleb Walker felt the full weight of the fight that was coming. The veterinarian in the next county worked late that night. A single lamp glowed above the examination table, while snow fell heavily outside the clinic windows. The storm that had begun in the mountains earlier that afternoon was now rolling across the valley like a slow-moving wall of white. Caleb stood beside the table while the doctor examined Titan's leg. The German shepherd lay perfectly still, his breathing calm despite the pain. "Good dog," the veterinarian murmured quietly as she wrapped the splint around Titan's leg. Caleb watched every movement. "Will he be able to run again?" he asked. The doctor looked up at him. "Yes," she said gently, "but he'll need time." "How long?" 6 weeks, maybe more." Caleb nodded slowly. Titan lifted his head and looked at him. Those steady amber eyes never carried fear, only trust. The doctor finished securing the bandage. "You're lucky," she added. "Another inch and the bone would have shattered." Caleb reached down and rubbed the dog's neck. "Titan's tougher than he looks." The doctor smiled faintly. "I can see that." Outside, the storm had grown stronger. By the time Caleb carried Titan back to the truck, snow was already drifting across the road in thick waves. Luke Greyhawk stood beside his truck, watching the sky. "This one's going to get ugly," he said. Caleb followed his gaze. The mountains had vanished completely behind swirling clouds. "Think we can make it back to the ridge?" Luke shook his head slowly. "You shouldn't even try." Caleb looked down at Titan lying across the passenger seat. The dog's leg was wrapped tightly in white bandage, but his eyes remained alert. Titan hated staying still. "Let's get moving," Caleb said. Luke frowned. "Caleb." "I know the road," Caleb interrupted quietly. Luke hesitated, then finally nodded. "All right." They left town together, Luke's truck leading the way. Snow whipped across the windshield in thick sheets. The road became harder to see with every mile. Headlights reflected off the falling snow until the world looked like a tunnel of white light. Inside the cab, Titan shifted slightly. Caleb reached over and rested a hand on the dog's shoulder. "You're okay," he whispered. The truck climbed slowly toward the ridge. Halfway up the mountain road, Luke's brake lights suddenly flashed. Caleb slowed. Luke's truck stopped completely. Caleb rolled down the window. "What is it?" Luke pointed ahead. A dark shape sat half buried in the snow near the side of the road. A car. Caleb leaned forward. The vehicle's hazard lights blinked weakly through the storm. Someone was inside. Titan lifted his head immediately. The dog began whining softly. Caleb's chest tightened. Luke stepped out of his truck and fought against the wind toward the stranded vehicle. Caleb grabbed his coat and followed. The snow nearly blinded him. By the time he reached the car, Luke had already opened the door. Inside sat a young woman gripping the steering wheel with frozen fingers. 2 children huddled in the back seat beneath a thin blanket. Their faces were pale, their lips trembling from the cold. The heater in the car had long since died. "How long have you been here?" Luke shouted over the wind. The woman shook her head weakly. 3 hours, maybe more. Caleb's stomach dropped. In this kind of storm, 3 hours could mean the difference between life and death. Titan began barking from the truck. Sharp, urgent. The dog knew something was wrong. Caleb turned back toward the car. "We need to move them now." Luke nodded. They helped the woman out first. Her legs nearly gave out when she tried to stand. Caleb wrapped his coat around her shoulders. Then he opened the back door. The 2 children inside were shaking violently. One of them, a small girl, barely responded when Caleb spoke to her. Hypothermia. Caleb lifted her carefully. "Luke, take the boy." Luke nodded. Snow whipped across the road as they carried the family back toward the trucks. Inside Caleb's cab, Titan immediately shifted closer to the little girl. The German shepherd pressed his warm body against her side. The girl's eyes fluttered open slightly. Her small hand rested in Titan's thick fur. The dog remained perfectly still, a living blanket of warmth. Caleb started the engine. Luke climbed into the passenger seat of his own truck. "Where do we take them?" he shouted through the open window. Caleb looked toward the road ahead. The ridge. His farmhouse. The only shelter nearby. "My place," he said. The trucks pushed forward through the storm. The climb up the mountain road was slow and dangerous. More than once the tires slipped on hidden ice, but eventually the faint outline of the Walker farmhouse appeared through the snow. Inside, Caleb built the fire as large as the stove would allow. Luke wrapped the boy in blankets. The woman sat near the stove, slowly regaining color in her face. The little girl lay beside Titan on the floor. The dog never moved. His injured leg stretched carefully beneath him, but the warmth of his body kept the child from slipping deeper into the cold. Hours passed before the storm finally began to calm. When the girl finally opened her eyes fully, she looked straight at Titan. Her small fingers curled into his fur. "Doggy," she whispered. Titan thumped his tail once. Caleb watched the moment quietly. Outside, the blizzard continued to bury the valley in snow. But inside the small farmhouse on Dead Ridge, a wounded German shepherd had just saved another life. Morning came slowly after the blizzard. The storm had left the valley buried beneath nearly 3 feet of snow. Pine branches sagged under the weight. Fence posts disappeared beneath white drifts. Even the old barn ruins looked softer now, half hidden under the quiet blanket of winter. Inside the farmhouse, the fire in the wood stove had burned through the night. Warm orange light flickered across the walls. Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hands. Across the room, Titan lay stretched beside the stove. His injured leg rested carefully on a folded blanket. The German shepherd's breathing was slow and steady. The little girl still slept beside him. Her hand rested gently against Titan's thick fur. Every now and then, Titan lifted his head just enough to check that she was still there. Then he settled again. Caleb watched the scene quietly. Something about it felt important. The farmhouse had been empty for years before he arrived. Now there were voices in the kitchen, footsteps on the floorboards, the soft rhythm of people moving through the rooms. Life had returned to the ridge. The young mother stood near the window, staring out at the snow-covered hills. Her name was Emily Carter. She had been trying to reach her sister's house across the valley when the storm trapped her car on the mountain road. Her 2 children, Ben and Lily, sat at the kitchen table finishing bowls of oatmeal Caleb had cooked over the stove. Luke Greyhawk leaned against the doorway, sipping coffee. "Storm's clearing," he said. "Roads might open by afternoon." Emily turned back toward them. "I don't know how to thank you," she said quietly. Caleb shook his head. No thanks needed. Her eyes moved to Titan. And him. The German shepherd lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice. Emily smiled. He kept Lily warm all night. Caleb glanced toward the dog. Titan's been saving people for a long time. A knock at the door interrupted them. Everyone looked up. Luke stepped onto the porch and opened it. An older man stood outside, brushing snow from his coat. He carried a leather briefcase tucked under one arm. Sorry to drop in unannounced, the man said. His voice carried the slow, careful tone of someone used to speaking in courtrooms. My name is Elliot Barnes. Luke stepped aside. Come in. It's freezing out there. Elliot stepped into the farmhouse and removed his hat. His eyes moved slowly around the room. Then they stopped on Caleb. You must be Caleb Walker. Caleb frowned slightly. That's right. Elliot set his briefcase on the table. I've been looking for you. Caleb felt a quiet tension rise in his chest. What for? Elliot opened the briefcase carefully. Inside were several folders filled with old documents. I used to represent your grandfather, Elliot explained. Caleb blinked. My grandfather? Elliot nodded. James Walker. The name felt strangely familiar. Caleb had seen it written inside the bunker journals. Elliot spread the papers across the table. Your grandfather built this farm nearly 60 years ago, he continued. Hard-working man, honest. Luke pulled up a chair. Emily listened quietly from the kitchen. Elliot opened one of the folders. Inside was a map of the valley. Lines marked property boundaries across the hills. This, Elliot said, pointing to a narrow strip of land, is the access road to your property. Caleb leaned closer. That road runs through Langston land, he said. Elliot smiled faintly. That's what Victor Langston wants people to believe. Caleb looked up. What do you mean? Elliot slid another document across the table. A deed, signed nearly 40 years earlier. Your grandfather owned that road, Elliot said. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Then how does Langston claim it? Elliot sighed. Because your grandfather became ill toward the end of his life. Early dementia. The room grew quiet. Elliot continued. Victor Langston convinced him to sign a land transfer agreement while he was not mentally competent. Luke muttered under his breath. Son of a... Elliot held up a hand. There's more. He pulled another folder from the briefcase. These are medical records from that time, and sworn statements from 2 witnesses who saw Langston pressure your grandfather into signing. Caleb stared at the documents. You're saying the contract was fake? Elliot nodded slowly. Legally questionable at best. Emily stepped closer to the table. So the Walker family never actually lost the road? Elliot shook his head. No. He looked directly at Caleb. Your family was forced out. The words hung heavily in the room. Caleb leaned back in his chair. The farmhouse creaked softly as the wind brushed against its walls. All those years, his father had said the family simply left the farm. But the truth was darker. They hadn't left. They had been pushed. Titan lifted his head from the floor. His amber eyes rested on Caleb. Steady. Calm. Elliot closed the folder. I've been trying to locate the last surviving Walker for years, he said quietly. Caleb looked up. Why now? Elliot smiled faintly.
Because when Victor Langston heard you bought the land, he tapped the stack of papers on the table. He started calling every lawyer in 3 counties trying to confirm his ownership. Luke leaned forward. And? Elliot's smile widened slightly. And I realized something. He looked directly at Caleb. The Walker family might finally have a chance to take the valley back. Outside the farmhouse window, sunlight broke through the storm clouds for the first time in 2 days. Snow glittered across the ridge. And somewhere down in the valley, Victor Langston had no idea the fight for the Walker land had just begun. The county courthouse in Alder Ridge stood on the corner of Main Street like it had for nearly a century. A square brick building,
Tall windows, a faded American flag moving slowly in the winter wind. The morning Caleb Walker walked through its doors, the whole town seemed to know about it. Pickups filled the parking lot. People gathered quietly along the sidewalks. In a small mountain town, stories traveled faster than the snowmelt in spring. And this story had been building for decades. Inside the courthouse hallway, the air smelled of old wood and paper. Caleb stood near the courtroom doors with Titan beside him. The German shepherd's injured leg had mostly healed by now. The white bandage was gone, though he still walked with a slight stiffness when the weather turned cold. Titan didn't seem to mind. His eyes scanned the hallway the way they always did, watching, guarding. Luke Greyhawk leaned against the wall nearby. Emily Carter sat on a wooden bench with her children. Even Martha Collins had closed her store for the morning. She stood near the window, arms crossed, her silver braid hanging over her shoulder. "Never thought I'd see the day," she muttered quietly. Caleb glanced at her. "The day what?" She smiled faintly. "The day someone finally stood up to Victor Langston." Across the hall, another group waited. Victor Langston stood among them. His gray coat looked expensive as ever. His posture calm. His expression confident. 2 lawyers stood beside him, flipping through thick legal folders. Langston noticed Caleb watching. Their eyes met across the hallway. Victor smiled. The same quiet, controlled smile Caleb remembered from the ridge, as if the outcome had already been decided. Titan gave a low rumble. Caleb rested a hand gently on the dog's neck. "Easy," he whispered. The courtroom doors opened. "Walker versus Langston," the clerk called. "Court is now in session." People filled the benches quickly. The judge, an older man with tired eyes and a steady voice, took his seat behind the bench. "Let's begin." Victor Langston's attorney spoke first. His voice was smooth and practiced. "Your Honor, my client has legally owned the road crossing the Walker property for over 30 years. The land transfer was signed, notarized, and recorded in the county office." He held up a copy of the document. "The Walker family abandoned the property voluntarily decades ago. My client has maintained the surrounding lands ever since." Victor Langston nodded slightly as the lawyer returned to his seat. Then Elliot Barnes stood. The older lawyer adjusted his glasses and walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom. His voice was quiet, but every word carried. "Your Honor, what Mr. Langston's attorney has failed to mention is the condition of the man who signed that document." Elliot opened a folder. "These are medical records belonging to James Walker." He handed them to the court clerk. "They show that Mr. Walker had been diagnosed with severe cognitive decline months before that land transfer was signed." A murmur moved through the courtroom. Elliot continued calmly. "We also have 2 sworn witness statements He held up another document. Both witnesses confirmed that Victor Langston visited Mr. Walker during that time and pressured him to sign the property agreement. Victor's lawyers stood immediately. "Objection!" The judge raised a hand. "Overruled. Continue." Elliot nodded. "There's more." He walked toward the judge's bench and placed a rolled map on the table. This is the original survey map filed when the Walker farm was established. The map spread across the desk. Clear black lines marked the property boundaries. And there, running through the center of the valley, the access road, owned by the Walker property, not Langston land. The courtroom fell silent. Victor Langston's confident expression began to tighten. Elliot looked back at the judge. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that the road was taken under false circumstances." He paused. "And without that road, Victor Langston's claim to the surrounding valley becomes questionable." The judge studied the documents carefully. The room held its breath. Even Titan remained perfectly still beside Caleb's chair. Finally, the judge looked up. "After reviewing the medical records, witness testimony, and original survey documents," he paused, then spoke the words that changed everything. "This court finds the land transfer agreement invalid." A ripple of shock spread across the room. The judge continued. "The Walker family retains legal ownership of the access road and all rights connected to the property." Victor Langston's face went pale. "The road is hereby restored to Caleb Walker." The gavel struck once. "Case closed." For a moment, no one moved. Then Martha Collins let out a quiet laugh. Luke clapped Caleb on the shoulder. Emily hugged her children tightly. Caleb remained seated for a second longer. Titan leaned gently against his leg. Caleb looked down at the dog. "Well, partner," he said softly, "looks like we're staying." Across the courtroom, Victor Langston stood frozen. The valley he thought he owned was slipping through his fingers. And for the first time in 30 years, the Walker name had returned to the Bitterroot Ridge. Spring came slowly to the mountains. The snow that once buried the valley began to soften beneath warmer sunlight. Long white drifts shrank day by day, revealing dark soil and patches of stubborn grass beneath. The creek at the edge of the Walker land began to run again. Water rushed down from the high ridges, carrying the last of winter away. 3 years passed, and the ridge changed. The old farmhouse still stood where it always had, but it no longer looked like a place forgotten by time. The roof had been rebuilt with fresh cedar shingles. The porch had been straightened and reinforced. Warm light glowed from the windows each evening. The barn, once collapsed beneath winter snow, now stood stronger than before, its new beams cut and placed by Luke Greyhawk's careful hands. Fences stretched across the pasture again. Smoke curled from the chimney most mornings. And where silence once ruled the ridge, there were now voices. Caleb Walker stood near the fence line, watching the sun rise over the Bitterroot Mountains. Titan sat beside him. The German shepherd had grown older. A thin patch of gray now showed along his muzzle, and his injured legs stiffened on cold mornings. But his eyes remained the same, sharp, steady, faithful. Below the ridge, several small cabins now stood near the edge of the property. They weren't large, just simple wooden shelters, but each one held a story. A man who had returned home from war with nowhere else to go. A family who lost their house after a hard winter. Travelers who needed a place to rest before continuing their journey. Caleb built those cabins slowly, one at a time. Luke helped raise the frames. Martha Collins delivered tools and supplies. Rosa Delgado sent food up the mountain whenever someone new arrived. What began as a broken farm had quietly become something else. A refuge. A place where people could start again. That morning, a pickup truck climbed the road toward the farmhouse. Titan noticed it first, of course. The dog's ears lifted. Caleb smiled faintly. "Expecting company today, partner?" The truck stopped near the barn. A young man stepped out. His clothes were worn. His shoulders carried the heavy posture Caleb recognized instantly. The posture of someone who had seen too much. The man walked slowly toward the fence. "You Caleb Walker?" he asked. Caleb nodded. "That's me." The young man looked around the ridge. His eyes moved across the cabins, the fields, the mountains stretching beyond the valley. "I heard this place helps veterans," he said quietly. Caleb leaned against the fence. "We try." The young man hesitated. "Name's Ryan." Titan walked forward slowly. The dog studied the newcomer carefully. Then he sat down beside him. Ryan looked down at the German shepherd. A small smile appeared on his face for the first time. "Guess he approves." Caleb chuckled softly. "Titan's a pretty good judge of people." Ryan looked back toward the cabins. "You think there's room for one more?" Caleb followed his gaze. The ridge stretched wide beneath the rising sun. 80 acres of land that once nearly disappeared into history. "Yeah," Caleb said quietly. "There's always room." Ryan nodded slowly. Titan stood and walked back to Caleb's side. The dog's tail moved gently through the morning air. As the young man headed toward the cabins, Caleb rested a hand on Titan's neck. They stood there together for a long time, watching the valley wake beneath the golden light of sunrise. 3 years earlier, Caleb Walker had arrived on this ridge with $5, a broken farmhouse, and a war still echoing inside his mind. Now the land had become something more than property. It had become home. Each night, when darkness settled over the mountains, a single lantern still burned in the farmhouse window. A quiet signal across the valley. A light on the ridge. And on the front porch, beneath the wide Montana sky, Titan always lay watch beside the door, guarding the place where broken roads finally led people home. Caleb looked down at the old dog. Titan glanced up at him. Caleb smiled. "We made it, partner." The wind moved softly across the ridge, and for the first time in a very long time, the land felt at peace. If Caleb and Titan's stories stayed with you even for a moment, I'd love to hear from you. Right now, scroll down and leave a very simple comment. Just type 1 if you believe a loyal dog can change a man's life. Or type 0 if you believe every veteran deserves a second chance. That's it. Just a 1 or a 0. It helps more people discover stories like this. And if you want, tell us where you're watching from today. People from all over the world gather here, and it's always amazing to see this community grow. Before you leave, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because the next story is already waiting. Another powerful story about courage, loyalty, and the kind of bond that never breaks between a veteran and the dog who stands beside him. So stay with us, because somewhere out there tonight, another forgotten road is leading to a story you won't want to miss.